All right. Welcome to part 3 of Psychedelics 101. Today we're going to be talking about the dark side of the movement. Before we get into that, just a couple upcoming events that we have. If you're not aware, today is Thank You Plant Medicine Day. There'll be a global wave of gratitude on the internet. So if you want to share your stories with people in your network, now's a great day. We also have some upcoming integration circles and then 2 more parts of Psychedelics 101, Returning to Reality and Blast Off Basics. I threw a link into the chat for everyone there. All right. So today we're going to be talking about some different problems. We're going to kind of go problems, examples, and solutions, and just kind of break down the list. Just kind of looking at some things that we see maybe as a dark side, some of the shadowy parts of the psychedelic world. Let's get into it in just a second. But before that, I think Elizabeth's going to read our disclaimer.
Welcome, everybody. Just a reminder that Alter State's integration and ASI wellness is not therapy, not intended as a substitute for therapy, counseling, or medical care. We are not licensed therapists, nor do we claim to diagnose, treat, or cure diseases. We are peer coaches providing a space for people to process the contents of their experience and receive reflective listening. This is a psychoeducational presentation and not to be meant to be construed as medical advice. We also don't condone or encourage the purchase, sale, or transfer of illicit substances, nor do we encourage or condone partaking in any unlawful activities related to illegal substances. And so please don't use our space for sourcing or promotion of retreat or substances, and refer to your local, state, country, and city laws regarding the use of psychedelics and alternative substances.
All right, let's all just practice being fully present for the next hour. Now's a great time to put your cell phone away if possible, silence your ringer. I'd like to bring in every one of our events with just a short mindfulness activity to help everyone become fully present. Here at Altered States Integration, this is one of our rituals. So just taking a moment, if it feels comfortable, closing your eyes, just spending a minute, turning your attention inwards, and slowing down and noticing. Mindfulness is really just a practice about noticing. Noticing what is. Noticing what stories we tell ourselves. Noticing different sensations that are alive. Let's start off with just noticing everything that's alive in your awareness right now. Then just spending a minute just using your sense of hearing. Can you hear? What's it like to hear my voice? What can you hear that's far away? What can you hear that's close by? What's it like to hear the sound of your very own breath from inside? Not getting attached, but just noticing. Now I want to invite everyone to just take 2 or 3 deep breaths as we really come into this space together. Starting off by exhaling all the lungs. Then inhaling in through your nose. Slowly, deeply breathing. Just noticing. Then exhaling once again. Let's take one more deep mindful breath all together in through the nose. Really feeling your lungs fill up. Noticing what it's like to have full lungs. Maybe taking an extra sip of air at the top. And then exhaling it all out, letting go of this practice. And returning back to our Zoom room. Maybe you're stretching just a teeny bit, whatever feels good in this moment. All right, let's get into it. Welcome back, everyone.
So to start out our presentation, I want to highlight some things around acculturation that are important. There is a difference between appreciation and appropriation. And so appreciation is when someone seeks to understand and learn about another culture in an effort to broaden their perspectives and connect with others. Where appropriation, on the other hand, is simply taking one aspect of the culture that is not your own and using it for your personal interests. And we see this a lot in the psychedelic space because a lot of the wisdom and knowledge has been kept by indigenous people through their culture in this time since psychedelics were kind of rejected by mainstream white Anglo-Saxon culture. So the problem with the acculturation in the psychedelic space often involves the appropriation and commercialization of sacred indigenous practices for profit without proper understanding or respect. For one, this can really dilute the cultural significance and distort the original meanings and methods of traditional psychedelic uses. So it's kind of like a bastardization of these practices, and they're not our practices to change. Moreover, it risks the exploitation of indigenous communities and their ancestral knowledge without fair compensation or acknowledgement. And that's something that we see a lot, where now we're taking this medicine and we think it's really great. Ayahuasca, comes from an indigenous tradition, yet those people who held this knowledge for so long are really not living in necessarily better conditions or making benefit or strides forward because of that, holding that knowledge for us. So, it can be exploitation just on the idea of going down and using that knowledge for our own. Another great example of this is Maria Sabina, who is the knowledge keeper of psilocybin mushrooms, who gave that information to Gordon Wasson in the Life article that he talks about, and she died destitute. And then it can also be disrespectful. So many people would understand if you went out and you took a Catholic religious symbol and wore it at a rave or, doing substances, they might find that to be, beyond the line of what they could do, especially if it's not from your own, if you weren't raised that way religiously. And in this picture, we see somebody who's wearing a headdress, which is ceremonial in nature, and it's something that's earned. So this person likely, we don't know his story, likely did not earn this headdress or necessarily understand the meaning of it. Some other examples of where we see this in the psychedelic space are people praying to the four directions in ceremony when they don't fully understand the context that those ceremonial rites are in. Also mimicking other Native traditions, trying to smudge the way a Native American would, or setting up their ceremonies that way. Now, it is really important to understand that some of these cultural practices may have a place in your own psychedelic experiences. One of the really important things is that if you're going to use these symbolisms, is to go back and educate yourself and actually go to Native people and understand what the context is and how those can be used within that religion. The other thought on this is also seeking to understand your own historical context of medicine use. So many of us come from a different tradition. There is alchemists, there are herbalists, there are other people out there who have maybe some of this context in our own ancestral line that we can understand those. I really encourage people to find out what those are and to see if those are useful to you. And then I think that we can make our own rituals. I think it's important to look at other people's ceremonial or religious practices and understand what is the essence of what we're getting out of this. And a lot of times it's simply having a ritual that represents a connection to things. So can you make your own ritual that is not imbibed in another culture's ceremony that represents something important to you? Yeah, do you have anything else to say on this, Toby?
No, I don't think so. I think you hit all the points that I think are important. So let's move on to our next problem or potential problem. So addiction. I think that this is definitely something worth talking about when we're starting to talk about the dark side of psychedelics. So many psychedelics are not necessarily considered physically addicting, but there is, I think, a risk of psychological dependence, particularly in people who are engaging in psychedelics seeking to escape from personal issues or reality. This misuse can kind of create a cycle of habitual use where the substance is used to cope with challenges instead of addressing maybe the underlying issues that people are trying to use psychedelics for. So talking a little bit deeper about that. I think the real one that I see a lot in the psychedelic community, especially in like more of the festival community, is problematic usage patterns with ketamine. A lot of the time, ketamine is a hugely potent antidepressant, and people fall into habitual usage, especially when using it in a recreational manner. And then I think social dependence is also really worth talking about. I think a lot of people end up relying on these substances in order to socialize, especially maybe like some MDMA and like the party scene. I think a lot of the time that this can then be necessary to get in the headspace or whatever somebody's looking for that night. So what's the solution to this one? I think education is a really big part. It's definitely something that drives us, education on the responsible use of psychedelics. And I think setting intentions, limitations, right? I'm only going to use ketamine twice a month. Something like that can really keep you out of a potentially sticky spot, right? I know about like the MDMA, I'm not going to call it a rule, guidance. Alexander Shulgin and his wife talked about taking MDMA once a season, so once every 3 months to kind of keep the magic and avoid falling into problematic usage patterns. So I think stuff like that's a really important part of how we can hold ourselves and our community accountable. Support systems, I think, are a huge part of addiction treatment and prevention. Therapy, community support groups, I think these kind of things are crucial for individuals that might be struggling with substance dependence. And then the last thing I want to say is harm reduction. If you know us, you know that we love harm reduction. I think that harm reduction strategies should be promoted across the board, but especially for people who are struggling with misuse or problematic usage patterns. Harm reduction can really reduce some of the risks that can happen in these usage cycles.
Another really important problem in the psychedelic space is the ecological impact of substance use that can go from production to harvesting. And it's a growing concern. Peyote and ayahuasca, where they're facing over harvesting. This not only threatens the sustainability of plants, but also disrupts the local ecosystem and biodiversity. And the increasing demand for psychedelic experiences puts additional pressure on natural resources and potentially leads to depletion. So really thinking about being a good steward of the environment, all of the environmental problems that we have with agriculture, herbs, and natural substances at large we have here. As you see here, we have a picture of some peyote. Now, my understanding is that this picture is peyote being transplanted. However, it is incorrect to harvest peyote in this way. And in fact, peyote is endangered or at risk in many of its natural habitats. And so it shouldn't be something, and it is federally protected. So it's not something that we should be going out and harvesting. And so we have drug tourism where people might be going out to try and wildcraft their own plants and doing it poorly. Like there's people who are professional wildcrafters who know how to harvest plants in a way that improves the environment or at least does not deplete from the population in the wild. We also have a growing need for ibogaine, and it's being over harvested. And this is in South Africa. And it can be sold illegally online, but the problem is that the root of this plant is the medicinal part. And so we have to dig up the entire plant. We're also digging up other plants that are around that plant if it's in the wild. Similarly, there's a surge for ayahuasca, and we've been worried about the two plants that make up that brew, the main components of that, in the Amazon rainforest, because people are cutting down trees. This is a vine. So in order to get a large amount of it, which is what people who are doing this more for a financial gain and aren't thinking about the sustainability of this medicine, aren't going out and harvesting from known areas. They're going out and they're just getting the plant however they can. So a lot of times this is clear cutting. We have some examples of this in the past. So it does seem like life is in abundance, but golden seal is a plant that is native to North America, and it used to be seen all the way from the Mississippi River Basin, all the way north and south, all the way to the eastern seaboard. And it's actually almost extinct in its natural habitat. And that has to do with finding out that it was a powerful medicine. And it only took about a period of about 50 years for that plant medicine to have been wiped out in its natural habitat. So if you see that out and about in those regions, don't pick it. And so that kind of leaves us to some ideas that we have about how we can conserve and how we can be better stewards of the planet. So conservation efforts, having ranges where these plants aren't allowed to be picked or wildcrafted at this time. And then avoiding, using wildcrafted plants. So growing medicine. So there are people who are using peyote who are growing it themselves. Now it's a very slow growing plant, so it takes a long time to have any significant harvesting. And then thinking about sustainable agriculture. So even as we move into the propagation of these plants, and like you can have an ayahuasca garden in certain ranges, and how are we going to learn to grow these as medicines, as herbal medicines, is that even we want to make sure that those agricultural practices are sustainable and that we're not just creating a new ecological problem with pesticides, herbicides, and runoff from fertilizers. And so I think one of the things that's also really important here is to think about how much we use these medicines. So a lot of the answers to some of these problems is using less and really taking into account how often it is necessary.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. Using less often means less overconsumption, right? Just by and large. So let's keep it moving. I don't think that any talk about the downside or the dark side of the psychedelic movement would be complete without talking about psychological damage. I don't think that this is a concern for lots of people, but I think it is really worth talking about because of the incredibly potent effects that these substances have on our brains and our bodies. And these powerful experiences, if not managed properly, definitely can lead to psychological harm that can include anxiety, psychosis, or exasperation of pre-existing mental health conditions. And I think all of these risks are increased in inappropriate use. So unsupervised settings, individuals with a history of mental illness, I think this all increases the risk of adverse effects. People taking psychedelics without professional guidance doesn't necessarily mean anything bad is going to happen, but it can leave individuals unprepared to process their experiences, which can lead to long-lasting issues. So obviously, we all know about bad trips, right? These do happen. And unfortunately, some people do get lasting side effects from bad trips. This can include paranoia, panic attacks, longer-term anxiety, and then depersonalization and derealization are also a major concern for these substances. So that's feeling like you're not yourself on a long-term basis, or derealization, feeling that life is not real for a long time. And then there also is a risk of activating, exasperating pre-existing mental health conditions. Scientists aren't quite sure what this looks like, but there definitely does seem to be a linkage between people with a family history of schizophrenia and people who have adult onset of this disease. So what's the solution to this problem? I think the first thing that I want to say is just like a thorough screening for family mental health issues, right? If possible, talking to your family, talking to your doctor about stuff that may be in your genetics. Not journeying in crisis, I think really can reduce the risk of having a bad experience, really making sure that you're grounded, that you're prepared for your experience can really help get the most out of an experience. Working with a professional, not necessary, but it definitely helps with the support, especially if you're working with a mental health professional and you're starting to have mental health issues. There is definitely an easier way to get support than if you're just kind of doing it by yourself. And then lastly, integration, I think, is huge. Even with a so-called bad trip, there's a lot to be learned most of the time. So really want to encourage everyone in our community to lean into integration, process your experiences, really figuring out ways to take those messages back to your real life and move it out like energetically after heavy experiences. Moving your body, getting it out of your brain by journaling can be really helpful in reducing some risks of psychological side effects.
Yeah, and overuse or improper use, or even what we might consider to be normal use of psychedelics, can lead to biochemical imbalances in the brain and other parts of the body. Substances affect our neurotransmitter system and can potentially lead to mood disorders, cognitive impairment, and mental health issues. We can also have some other biochemical dysfunctions, just based on the fact that we're putting our body under stress. And so people with certain medical conditions can have problems. And a lack of understanding regarding long-term neurochemical and biochemical effects of psychedelics just kind of exasperates this issue. So basically, we're looking at change in homeostasis of what the body is normally like. There can be serotonin syndrome, which is where the body is not processing serotonin normally, and it can actually cause a lot of psychosis type symptoms. People coming on and off their SSRI medication can have some pretty profound effects, as well as medications that or psychedelics that interact with SSRIs. Mood disorders are part of this. So some frequently high doses, can improve, frequent or high doses of psychedelics can disrupt your chemistry and lead to mood disorders or cognitive impairment. And then, MDMA is part of your serotonin system. So it can actually exacerbate depression, and long-term use can disrupt your serotonin system, leading to depletion. So that's some problematic things. There's also this biochemical place where we might also see where people have difficulty with maintaining blood sugars during psychedelics. They may have some hyper or hypotension, so blood pressure can be affected during psychedelics, causing medical crises within those. So what are the solutions to some of these? More research about the long-term effects and brain chemistry is really important to mitigating risks. Again, if you have some of the factors, whether it's medications or health issues, working with a professional, and there are professionals out there who have the experience to work with you around psychedelic usage. And then I think moderation is a really important place here. Yeah, again, full high doses are not necessarily necessary for everybody to do. And then, just thinking about having mental health providers help you to maintain this. All right, so let's talk a little bit about spiritual bypassing, which is the habitual avoidance of emotional work disguised by the rhetoric of a spiritual practice. Now, this is not just seen in psychedelics, it's seen in all kinds of different spiritual practices. The psychedelic state is, something where it does tap into the spiritual, and it can give us a lot of different feelings of your euphoria, and it can become a place that we seek more for the feeling of the drug versus the emotional changes that we're looking for. Oftentimes this is seen in people who go party for the weekend, and it leaves you feel positive, but by Wednesday their life is falling apart, and they kind of go through this cycle multiple times. I think there's sometimes a belief that can arise that psychedelics are the answer for everything. So I had a bad thing happen at work, I go do psychedelics. I am unsure about the answer to my problems with my partner, so I go do psychedelics. Now, it's not that psychedelics can't be helpful in those places, it's thinking it's the answer. I think that it's also part of there can be some magical thinking around psychedelics where we start to cast off maybe some more scientific beliefs and think that psychedelics are the answer. And then it can also lead to psychedelic exceptionalism, thinking about psychedelics as being more beneficial than drugs or therapy or other interventions. So what's the solution here? Integration is a really important part of doing the work. So there's lots of types of integration. These are just a few examples that we have. So there's more formal things like somatic work or peer integration support, which is what we do here at Altered States Integration. There's also doing things that are maybe more alternative, like drawing or pottery or flow arts. And then there's self-directed integration, taking time, contemplative time in nature, doing a self-help book, or yoga and meditation. And I think really looking for feedback around people in your community to help you also as mentors and
Yeah, integration definitely helps with a lot of these problems, I think, or potentially can. So unethical behaviors and predators. Unfortunately, we do see this a lot in the psychedelic space, and many other spiritual and healing communities, honestly, unfortunately, have a pretty big problem with predators who are trying to exploit vulnerable individuals seeking healing. There's a lot of different kinds of ways that this exploitation can happen. It can look like financial, sexual, emotional abuse, and many of the people who are drawn to psychedelics are particularly vulnerable to such exploitations, unfortunately. So we obviously, or maybe not obviously, but have the classic situation of like unethical shamans or unethical guides or unethical therapists taking advantage of participants in psychedelic ceremonies. This can lead to, and we do see sexual assault, financial exploitation, and all sorts of other unsavory behaviors. We can also see cult-like groups forming around a charismatic leader who misuse psychedelics to control or abuse followers, right? If you don't act in line, you don't have access to the sacrament anymore, which can be problematic and self-reinforcing when lots of people are doing good work with this substance. And then the third example I want to talk about is noted abuse that happened during the MDMA trials off camera. There's a whole podcast on this called Cover Story that we put up top by the New York Times. But we saw even in clinical trials that were videotaped, abuse still happened. They just took them off of the area that was in the video. So all over the place, unfortunately, we see potential problems from abusers, from predators, and from people who are acting poorly. So what's the solution to this one? It's a pretty big problem. So I'm not going to claim that I can cure it in 1 or 2 steps, but I think our field really needs higher ethical standards. Medicine in general has really high ethical standards for a reason. Lots of bad behavior. So over time, I think as we see more and more bad things happening in our space, we'll need higher ethical standards, really delineating what is and is not acceptable behavior for people who are going to be making a profession out of holding space for other people. And then just more oversight, more monitoring across the board. I don't quite know what that looks like. Community oversight, community support groups to help people that have been harmed, as well as different procedures for calling out bad actors in our space. But I definitely think that this is something that we need to counter and combat as we're maturing in the psychedelic space. All right, up next, we have the stigmas associated to drugs and racial disparities. This is 2 different problems, but we group them together because I think they are, by and large, a social problem. And unfortunately, this problem kind of mirrors the greater cultural context that we're seeing in the United States of America right now and across the world. Getting into it, there's a huge racial disparity, both in arrest rates and sentencing for psychedelic drug offenses. Unfortunately, minorities are profiled and arrested more, and then they often will receive harsher penalties than their white counterparts would, which is pretty fucked up when we get down to it. So there's a lot of different aspects to this, I think, but a big part of it, at least in the United States, is legalization not actually addressing the problems, right? People were arrested for cannabis usage, and when they ended up legalizing it in certain states, they didn't bail people out of jail. They didn't release people for something that was now legal. So I think that's a pretty big problem. Other things, like from the social side of things, is that people who are drug users oftentimes are unable to take certain positions. I know anyone with a security clearance is asked if they have ever taken drugs in the past. Nurses and doctors, I think a lot of the times, might be unethical or not a good fit because of past psychedelic usage. And oftentimes, I think these are people who might need the psychedelic healing the most, are barred from taking these substances because of legal and federal stuff. So what's the solution for this one? If you know us, you know that we're big advocates of decriminalization. Decriminalization and legalization, I think, really are a big step in fighting this side of the movement, right? The stigma really goes away, or it can go away, if more people are taking these substances and having their own experiences versus just receiving propaganda via media. So what can you do about it? I think advocating for drug policy reform across the board at local and larger governments can really help. You can put pressure on your local mayor to decriminalize psychedelics in your town. Your city council can decriminalize psychedelics. And then we can also advocate for implementing community policing strategies that focus on harm reduction instead of incarceration.
And, you know, avoiding psychedelic exceptionalism is part of the conversation here too, and the way that we interact with people, and noticing our own bias around substances and not letting those get in the way of how we interact or act with people based on their substance of choice. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the legal and social problems that are associated with substance use. We already talked about a bunch of these in the previous slide, but really, at this point in time, people can still come under local or federal jurisdiction for substances, for possessing substances. And in fact, Denver man is facing up to 20 years in prison, and that has to do with mushrooms, even though they've gone the decriminalized process. So having large amounts can still put you at risk. Having small amounts can still put you at risk because it can be used as a reason to search and seizure. So it can lead to harassment by the police. You know, there's also some bureaucratic hurdles around, you know, using some of these medicines as far as whether they're medicine or covered by insurance. And, you know, some people might, you know, have some social stigmas about using these things, partly because of the war on drugs and all the mythology that goes into that. But also it might be against social or religious beliefs in their social circles. And so that may prevent them from either seeking the care that they need or being able to process their experience afterwards, because they might feel like they have no one to talk to in their circle of friends who would understand the profound experience that can be psychedelics. So some of the solutions are advocating for a grow, gift, gather style of decriminalization, putting pressure on local governments and to legalize the substances and to legalize them in a way that provides reciprocity for people maybe who were convicted before the change in laws. And then just really kind of watching how we present psychedelics, I think, is really important part of a social part of change. That's why we celebrate Thank You Plant Medicine. That's today, February the 20th, where it's a social media blitz in order to promote psychedelics and their healing. So giving testimonials so as to normalize the use of psychedelics as part of ritual or part of personal growth.
All right, adulteration. This is definitely a problem that's brought about because of the unregulated and illegal market for substances. So this can lead to substances being cut with harmful adulterants, increasing risks. This can lead to receiving substances that aren't actually what you're trying to get. So the number one risk, I think, here is fentanyl, unfortunately, is increasingly found in drugs. This is actually the number one cause of death for, I think, everyone under 40. The number one cause of death is fentanyl overdoses. So what can we do about this? Like, this is such a big problem. Obviously, fully legalizing drugs across the board, cocaine, heroin, all the drugs, and providing a safe access is the easiest way to prevent this adulteration. And I think it's probably also the hardest from like a societal level. So decriminalization and legalization do make substances more safe, but as we're waiting to get to that point in drug policy, we are big advocates for drug testing. We have a whole class on drug testing, how to test for fentanyl, how to test to make sure your substance is what you think it is, and it's not an LSD-like substance instead of LSD. But harm reduction and drug testing is a really essential part of being a safe user, especially in these times of fentanyl adulteration in a large percentage of the drug supply. All right, our next issue is corporadelica. So this is a cute term that Symposia came up with. They defined it as manifesting corporate structures, ethos, or logic within the context of the psychedelic landscape. Yeah, so all of the problems that we see in modern medicine are unfortunately kind of being brought over into psychedelic medicine as we're moving towards a medicalization process. So that is toxic corporate policies, toxic corporate culture, all of the abuses that we kind of see in the medical model, low wages, overworking, profit-driven ideals. So a lot of that we are unfortunately seeing in the psychedelic space. Other problems are also volunteer inequalities, right? People being asked to volunteer for a lot, it's just to get a free ticket to an event, to get their foot in the door. And then we also see a lot of, I'm going to say, BS, where people are trying to patent natural substances. We've had people try to patent calm tone of voice as a healing modality. There's a lot that we're seeing just in terms of corporate problems being brought into this world, and it's kind of sad. Even some of the biggest players in the game, we're seeing transition from being a public benefit corporation to being a for-profit for the shareholders model. So what are the solutions? Community, I think, is really the solution. More psychedelic community-based programs, whether that's education or access. Community-based programs, I think, are the way to go. And something I think that we're seeing, and we'll see more of, is psychedelic co-ops. Right now, we see the Brooklyn Psychedelic Co-op as being by the members for the members. And I think we'll see more of this in the future as we move towards whatever the future psychedelic villages look like. I think that relying on each other instead of corporations is going to be a big part of how we can ethically make this work.
And lastly, we want to touch on this little known part of the psychedelic world where there's some overt animal cruelty happening. And so what we have here is a picture of some really important frogs and toads. And these animals secrete a fluid from their glands when they are stressed that has psychedelic properties. And the thing is that, as you see, that this toad at the top is basically being molested in order for it to be stressed, for it to produce this medicine, which is then scraped off of its body. So these toads are kept alive in captivity for long periods of time, and they are frequently stressed, which is different than what might happen in the wild, where they might, be stressed once in a while, or partially these toads are trying to be milked for their maximum amount of psychedelic fluid. And so these are animal-based medicines. We have the combo frog and the bufo frog. And there really is a problem where, one, more and more of them are being taken out of the wild and brought into captivity, and then they're being abused in order to get their medicine. Now, there are some synthetics of these compounds that can be used, and that is what may be a solution to using these frogs, is that maybe we use this synthetic version. And while synthetics may have a different ecological impact and may not be as preferred, they are clean, they are available, and some people report more profound experience with these medicines as they are more consistent to use. And then again, thinking back to using less often. So understanding that if you are using a natural medicine, that maybe using less often is a way to reduce the impact on the environment and on animals. So what is the future like? So we want to really just end this presentation with saying that it's not all doom and gloom. Psychedelics are not inherently good or bad, and really encourage a duality approach. One of the principles that we encourage people to understand is about the principles of harm reduction by the Harm Reduction Coalition. And one of the principles is to be real about the very real risks of psychedelics. And so we want to think about what what the risks are and just know them so that we can make more informed decisions. Really leaning into decriminalization, leaning into community groups, thinking about buying locally and acting locally, looking into education, educating yourself about the medicine that you're planning on using. Making that part of the process before partaking in the medicine can help you go deeper and have a wider depth of an experience with psychedelics.
All right. I think that brings us to the end of today. I'd love to invite everyone on the call for our next session next week. And then there's a lot here, obviously, right? Each of these topics we talked about for 2 or 3 minutes. So we have a lot of different education that you can check out on alteredstatesintegration.com to really go deeper on all of these topics. All of these topics honestly deserve a full hour, but obviously we can't do that in just an hour. So full invitation to connect, to go a little bit deeper if that is something that calls to you on any of these topics. All right. And now we got a couple minutes left for questions. If anyone has any questions that they want to throw in the chat, feel free to do so. We also threw our link for Instagram if you want to follow us there. We have lots of different content, both poking fun at some of the problems in psychedelics, as well as more of the educational side. Yeah, so buy local, meaning not traveling to different countries. Yeah, if possible. I think there is some very real problems with psychedelic tourism. Ecological, right? Getting on an airplane is never really the ecological choice. But also, like, there's only so many people that can go do ayahuasca in the jungle, right? Just, I think, as a result of these old school medicines meant for hundreds of people, meant for a tribe, there's not necessarily the infrastructure for thousands of people to do it. But then also, like, buying locally if possible, buying magic mushrooms that are locally sourced instead of coming from across the country or across the world. And it's not always possible to know where your substances are from, but asking questions and then trying to support people that are locally producing. Anything you want to add on that one, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think it's also about considering if there is a psychedelic that is more local to you, that's more sustainable to you. Instead of buying some sort of exotic psilocybin mushroom, buying from a local grower who may just be doing your average cubensis, and that is equally valid to use. Or thinking about trying to obtain medicines that are produced from someone who is starting to grow some of the ayahuasca components in tropical environments in the US. And as we ask for those, and the reason that we talk about it is because as we ask for them, consumer demand can drive what is available. When we look for medicines that are in tune to us, then there's more of those that are available. And there might be a premium price involved. However, that ensures that that person can improve their own production. It creates a place where other people can start businesses producing more locally and sustainably than the clear-cut harvesting that happens with plant products worldwide.
All right. Any other questions before we hop off our call today? All right. Well, thank you for everyone who made it to the live call. Thank you to everyone watching this on the recording. I'm Toby, and that's Elizabeth from Altered States Integration. See you next week with part 4 of Psychedelics 101.